week is our last lecture for the season. Our final speaker in the series is Professor Reed Moss from University of Central Florida. He's a conservation biologist. He's done a lot of work on large landscape conservation, wildlife corridors, and his talk is Wildness, Wilderness, and Biodiversity. We need all three. So he is going to be our final speaker in the series. So just as a reminder, again, bringing back the overall theme of this semester, which has been Wilderness on the Edge, our lecture series has focused on the many different ways in which we define wilderness in different changing landscapes. And we've talked about some different landscapes, and we've talked about some different definitions of wilderness and wildness. And tonight we're going to look at yet another definition. Tonight's topic is one that's near and dear to my heart. I grew up in a very urban place, playing in ditches and culverts, and finding a lot of personal value, but also significant biological value in those landscapes. I liked them enough that I went on to become a biologist. I remember my dad always telling me growing up, we'd be hiking and catching frogs in the ditches behind my house, which was next to I-96, which is the second largest interstate in the country. At least it was. And I used to say, "Oh, that's the sound of a waterfall." And he'd be like, "Yeah, it's the sound of a waterfall." So tonight we're going to be looking at those types of landscapes and the value that they have for aesthetic and biological reasons. Emma is going to be our speaker tonight. Emma Marris is an environmental writer and reporter. She's written for the world's foremost science journal. Many of you have probably read articles from this journal in class, the journal Nature. She's written on ecology, conservation biology, and many other topics, and her work for Nature led her in some ways to the topic of tonight's talk, and her first book, which was published in 2011, The Rambunctious Garden, which we have here available for anyone who's interested in purchasing after the talk. The book highlights alternative conservation strategies that do not necessarily focus on holding or returning land to its historical baseline, but working with landscapes that have been managed or have been managed in some way in the past and are allowed to just go wild. Emma comes to us originally from Seattle, Washington, but she now lives in Columbia, Missouri, where she finds wildness in drainage ditches and conservation potential in suburban cul-de-sacs and soy fields. Tonight, Emma's going to be talking about the paradox of wilderness in contemporary conservation. In order to keep many wilderness areas and the idea of wilderness pristine, we actually have to intensively manage many of these areas. And students that have had my classes in the Wilderness and Civilization program, this is a topic that we've visited over and over again, that to get those pristine stands of white bark pine that are slowly disappearing, we're now looking at intensive management strategies. To deal with bark beetle kill, we're looking at intensive management strategies to keep those areas that we considered wild pristine. So what Emma's going to be looking at tonight in her talk is, what if instead we define wilderness as unmanaged landscapes? That would then mean that the new wild, the idea of wild, could become any novel ecosystem in which areas are left to go wild. So all of a sudden, this opens us up not just to our kind of working, maybe historical definition of wildness or wilderness, but it opens us up to all these other areas that are left unmanaged. Those could be agricultural fields that have gone feral. They could be urban greenscapes that are allowed to go wild. Abandoned lots in large cities that are allowed to return to their original form. So it opens up these whole new possibilities for areas that we can call wild. So with that, I would like to welcome Emma to our lecture series tonight.
Okay. Thank you so much for that introduction. This is a short reach mic. But I'm told that they're taping it, so I have to use it. So I guess I'll speak up. Thank you for the wonderful introduction. Maybe I should just go straight to Q&A after that. But I made all these nice slides, so let's go through them. So what I want to talk about in this 40 minutes is what's sort of wilder, this
or this. And that's, you can see where I'm going with it, right? Like the sort of intuitive answer is that this is the wilderness, and the answer I'm going to try to give you is that this is the wilderness. This is an area on the Big Island of Hawaii that's been let go, that nobody has managed for a long time, and it's pretty covered in exotic species, and nobody's paying any attention to it, and people are dumping their cars there, and there are no management oversight bodies or stakeholder meetings about this area, and there are no environmental impact comment periods about this area, and there are no signs when you enter this area telling you what you can and cannot do. It's just kind of hanging out. And areas like this have been started to be called novel ecosystems because they're unfamiliar to us. But in some ways, novel ecosystems is kind of a weird title because every ecosystem is novel if you look back far enough in time. So maybe a better term might just be unfamiliar ecosystems or surprising ecosystems. Ecosystems that we are not expecting to see. So this is the book that Natalie mentioned. This is how I got to these ideas. Is I first wrote a bunch of features for Nature about conservation and ecology. And then when these same themes kind of kept coming up over and over again, I decided that I was sufficiently obsessed about discussions about pristine wilderness to write a book about it. And this is the book. And the idea behind the book was really to talk to the whole general public about what counts as nature, and what is this sort of notion of pristine wilderness done to our ability to save nature. And the argument is that the more we obsess about pristine wilderness, the more we close off certain potential tools that we might use to do things like protect biodiversity or enhance natural goals. I have a little bit of a cold, so I apologize for my voice. So I'll just go through that argument really fast. Here's the Garden of Eden. This is the kind of a lay notion that many people have, and that I had before I started writing about conservation and ecology for Nature, which is that if you go back far enough, you come to a state in any particular ecosystem that was pre-human, perfect, timeless, unchanging, the correct state, the Garden of Eden for that system. I grew up in Seattle, so I was surrounded by a lot of old-growth forests, and I was very smug that we had this because I believed that those areas were in the Garden of Eden state, and that unlike many other areas, we hadn't screwed it up and diverged and plucked that apple and fallen, but that we actually had some pieces of the original Garden of Eden at home. But this Garden of Eden myth is often based on this sort of lazy assumption that when Europeans showed up in a place, and I'll just go ahead and focus on North America here, that land was totally untouched by humans. But we all know that there were people living in North America, South America, Australia, the Pacific Islands, New Zealand. All these places were just covered with people. And they were doing all sorts of stuff to the land all the time. They had agriculture, they had cities, they had hunting regimes, no-take zones, and they had rules, and they had fire, and they were managing the land constantly. So the landscapes that our Garden of Edens that we often look to, were just basically a different form of human management. And then, of course, there is the inherent dynamism of ecosystems, right? So for a while, I kept thinking that I might find this perfect, that like, okay, yes, there's been this whole cultural myth that pre-European landscapes were somehow pristine wildernesses. But that if we just go back before anybody shows up, then we'll find our pristine wildernesses. But the problem is that if you go back the day before people showed up, it looks like this. And it's not only is a lot of places covered in ice, everything else is totally different because all of the sort of ecosystems have been mushed down and changed. And as the ice moves up and down, they all get mushed and stirred, and the trees move around, and the junipers and the pines are together, and then they're apart. And so this dynamism through change driven by even non-human factors means that there is no one day. There is no June 3rd, 1 million years ago that we can go to and say, this is our Garden of Eden, let's go back there. Now, for a lot of people working in conservation or especially managers on the ground, this is not news, and these discussions have been going on for a long time. But I think that for the general public, This Garden of Eden, pristine wilderness stuff has still been incredibly important cultural narrative. And even for people who do work in the field, I think it's kind of in our heart somewhere, right? That this is still, that there still is a right answer, that there still is a place you can go back to that is correct. So what I try to say in the book is that that place doesn't exist, that there's no home to go through. And then I kind of, realized that many people will find this very sad. But I wouldn't have written the book if it ended with just this sad thing, that there is no home, and now we all just, slit our wrists in a warm bath, right? The book then goes, okay, but great, actually that's wonderful, because that means now we can start looking to the future and figuring out what we want these places to look like. And I'm not talking about super radical, crazy things like, hey, let's just take every brown bird from all around the world and put them in one place, I'm talking about fairly subtle shifts of policy here and management. But there are a few new tools that you can use, and here's probably the most crazy one, which is using proxies in ecosystems. So here's this, let's say you've got some function that you want and you value and you desire to have continue, but the thing or the species that was helping you do that function is gone. It's extinct or locally extinct. Well, if you can't bring it back because it's extinct, one option is to use another species to do that job. So this is a nature reserve in the Netherlands called the Oostvaardersplassen. And the fellow who was running this reserve, an ecologist named Frans Vera, was very interested in returning grazing as a big force to Europe. But he thought that it's his own theory that grazing used to be an incredibly important ecological function there. But the wild horses and aurochs and various large herbivores that would have done this grazing are all extinct. So in his reserve, he brought in these horses, which are a special breed of Polish horse that are very similar to wild horses, but not the actual wild horses. And he also brought in this breed of cattle, which are very kind of, well, maybe not that similar, but they look sort of like aurochs, and they're doing some of the grazing work. And so what he's got here is this kind of really intense savanna in the middle of the Netherlands. It's like half an hour from Amsterdam. And it's an incredibly cool place. It's got this very wild feeling. Because you go out there and there's these big herds and there's these long vistas and there's animal corpses on the ground, which is something that is usually illegal in the Netherlands. And he has to get special permission to allow the kind of, there to be corpses there for the scavenger guild. And then he has all these cool birds that just showed up after he started tinkering it with it in this way. And that's the sort of payoff, right? He gets these interesting eagle species and other large birds that haven't nested anywhere near this area in hundreds of years, because there's something in what he's doing that they're responding to. So this is the sort of far out kind of interventions that become possible when you don't become totally purist. When you say, we're not going to be 100% bounded by what was here historically. We're going to let the composition be different. Another thing that I think becomes more possible when you set aside this notion of pristine wilderness as the goal, or you set aside this historical baseline, is sort of doing conservation work in more places. Because when you're just sort of mentally focused on conservation and wilderness, you don't see all the little bits and pieces of nature that are all around that can be put to good use. And so this is an industrial, well, this is the Duwamish River in Seattle. There's an industrial site there. And this is a street end, which is a little tiny piece of land that's owned by the city. It's like when they plat out the streets, they go all the way into the river, but they don't put the concrete all the way into the river. They stop because they don't want you driving into the river. So there's this little piece of kind of nothing in between the end of the concrete and the beginning of the river that's owned by the city. So for most of time, this was just, I don't know, gravel and cigarette butts probably. But now what it is this little park that has these logs that are there to create little byways for salmon that are coming upstream to hang out in and rest on their journey. And it has these plantings, which are lots of natives, but a few non-natives as well. And then it has this area here. This corner is a picnic table where you can have a little, if you work at this industrial facility, you can go have your lunch there. So in an area about the size of 3 parking spaces, they're getting biodiversity, wildlife habitat, human recreation values, beauty from the river when you're kayaking up and down this river, which you can do as long as you don't swim in the river or drink it, because it's a super fun site. it looks gorgeous. So that's the, and there's a lot of opportunities for stuff like this all over the world. Not just in cities, but in suburbs and in industrial sites and in agricultural areas. And all of those just sort of become more obvious as projects. So the way I like to think about it is that, and I sometimes show a map of the wilderness system, which, as you know, seems vast when you're in the middle of one of them, but when you look at it on a map, it's like freckles on the map. But then if you look at a map of permeability of North America, just where all the places that are actually impermeable, like water can't get in because it's a roof or a road, and then everything else is highlighted, suddenly the entire continent is like practically, I think we're something like less than 1% impermeable. And as far as I'm concerned, anything that's permeable has promise, because you can grow something there, and you can start something there, and you can improve it. Maybe you have crops that you're growing, you can always improve how you're growing your crops. So there's always opportunity to deepen the value that you get from any space. And even that 1% is not forever. You can always remove concrete, and maybe someday instead of ripping out invasive species, the kind of hip thing to do will be to just go out and jackhammer up some old suburbs. That would be pretty cool. So having said all that, what about wilderness? Because all of this stuff I'm talking about is talking about increasing intervention. It's about accepting that the humans have caused huge changes to the earth, and I haven't even touched on contemporary changes, climate change, land use change, partly because I just don't think I can sit here and go through that list one more time. It's so depressing. But I assume that you all are aware that humans have a very large impact in 2013 on the planet. So she's not sure that you guys know enough about this. I can recommend some excellent speakers, very depressing speakers. I have a list of people that will depress the hell out of you. So is there a space for non-intervention? And so here's the Wilderness Act, part of the Wilderness Act that talks about what is wilderness. And I'm sure that if you're in the class about wilderness, you probably have looked at this before. And I just did some underlining and bolding and so on. And there's a real tension here, right? Because you want, the Act suggests that wilderness has to be untrammeled, it has to be unrestrained. But it also suggests that it has to have this primeval character, like it has to look like it used to. And my suggestion is that as we continue to put pressure on the planet, as we continue to change the climate, as we continue to change how we're using the lands directly across the street from our wildernesses, and as we continue to throw propagules, throw seeds and new animals of non-natives into our wilderness, it's going to be more and more difficult to try to do both of these at the same time, to try to make it look like it did 100 years ago, 200 years ago, and to not mess with it. I think it's going to become, to the breaking point, impossible in some places. So, just to hammer this home, here's a picture from Yellowstone. They're removing lake trout here. They're trying to make sure that their cutthroat trout have a fighting chance, so they're taking the lake trout out. These are two species that are competing. The lake trout are non-native and the cutthroat are native. And this is just one now of the many interventions that are going on like every single day at Yellowstone. And I use Yellowstone as an example because for many people, Yellowstone is the icon of wilderness. I was actually surprised to know that it's actually just technically a recommended wilderness. But they say on their website that it is being managed, that 2 million of the 2.2 million acres are being managed as wilderness in accordance with the Act. So for our purposes, we can say this is wilderness, or at least it is sort of legally recommended wilderness. So here are a couple of the things that they're doing in this wilderness to keep it wild. So they're weeding. I spent a lot of time looking at various action plans, management plans, preparing for this talk. And it's kind of interesting just the way that they talk about these actions. So with the weeding, they surveyed in 2010, they did 20,000 acres, and they treated, about 5,000 acres. So that means basically spraying and pulling and so on. It says by 2011, this is from their invasive vegetation management plan. So this is just the vegetation, not the fish. By 2011, permanent and seasonal resource management operations staff are spending 36% of their work hours on non-native plant management, with most of that time used to pull or spray weeds. So in the Garden of Yellowstone, there's a lot of weeding going on. Also a lot of managing of the fauna there, the bison and the bears and the other big guys. This is from the bison sort of white paper from August 2012 about how to manage the bison herd this year. And I just loved how precise this was, because it gives you a sense of the level of control. It says, Yellowstone bison are managed towards an end of the winter guideline of 3,000 animals. Managers at Yellowstone National Park also want to progress towards equal abundance in the central and northern breeding herds, an equal proportion of males to females, and an age structure of about 70% adults and 30% juveniles. So to get to this very precise structure, they recommend the harvest of 25 adult male bison from the central herd in the western management area, and the harvest or culling of 425 bison, 400 females, 25 males from the northern management area. So these are very precise management. And one last thing I'll read to you is just from the fuel load reduction that they do there in order to avoid some fires getting out of control, is they go in and they basically just cut things down. So it's another form of sort of pruning, I guess, if you like, the Garden of Yellowstone. They mention here in their hazard fuels management guidelines that initially, following treatment, a developed area will appear more groomed, with the trees being more uniformly spaced. However, over time, wind throw, regeneration, and the accumulation of other forest debris will result in a less managed appearance. So they're reassuring us here that this groomed look that we will initially get will go away over time. So yeah, and I'm not saying that this is bad. I want to express that right away. The management goals of Yellowstone, probably more than any other park, with possible exception of Yosemite, or place in the country, are so multifarious and complicated and culturally loaded that I pity anybody whose job it is to actually decide who to send where with what herbicide on what day, because it's just a huge ball of yarn. But I just want to make it clear that there's a lot of management going on in wilderness. And here's a picture I took in Australia where they have a big problem with non-native critters like foxes and cats and rabbits and so on, impacting their native ecosystems. This is a wilderness type area that they have actually succeeded in removing these non-natives from. But this is what the fence around it looks like. And not only does it kind of look like a maximum security facility, but the reason that they have a road on each side is for patrols, right? Because it doesn't end, it never stops. You get every little fox and cat out of that area, and it takes you years, and lots of poison, and lots of guns, and lots of traps. And then, forever, you patrol, because they're going to get back in, and you need to be ever vigilant. So this is how you keep things wild. Okay. So here's another example. This is what the lowland wet forests of Big Island in Hawaii look like today. And it looks actually kind of very jungly and sort of what we might expect, except like this is almost all non-native. This is just all kinds of stuff from everywhere. So there was this cool experiment that I visited a few years ago where they actually went in and took out everything, like by hand, everything that wasn't native. And it took them, I've got it down here. I think it took them 400 hours or something like that. It took them forever to do this. And then they had to keep weeding it. And this is what it looked like when they were done. So it's like basically like lava and moss. And then there's like a couple little guys in there. And they put flags where their natives were so they wouldn't miss them. And so once I saw this, it just became totally clear to me that there was no way that they were going to be able to do this for any large area in lowland wet forests of Hawaii. I mean, unless some religious fervor for lowland wetland forests of Hawaii swept the country and everybody who currently donates to religious charities suddenly sent all their money to these people and they hired like 4,000 people. I don't know. I couldn't figure out a way it could happen. Okay, and here are just a few more. California condors that we raise with puppets seems very interventionist. Peregrine falcons, which we reintroduce after hybridizing a whole bunch of different subspecies together, kind of interventionist. Yellow-legged frogs that we go out and paint with bacteria that resist chytrid fungus. So when the fungus gets there, they'll have some so we're like kind of vaccinating, mothering, arranging marriages. You know, we've got a lot of intervention going on. Oh, I guess maybe I put too many of these. But these are the chestnuts, the American chestnuts that they have bred to be resistant to the chestnut blight that totally decimated the eastern forests. And the hope is that someday these guys their seeds will be planted all over. Not unlike the white bark pine projects that they're working on in this area. So we may see a future where some of just the wild trees are sort of bred, if not genetically engineered. Okay, so this is maybe what wilderness looks like. It's not so bad, huh? This is a pretty much unmanaged place. This is the Seychelles. And this is all cinnamon, which is non-native. So I started with a pretty picture because I wanted to ease you into the idea of liking these places. So what I'm going to show you now are some places where we're not doing any of that stuff. We are not hazing or culling or introducing or spraying and where we're just basically doing nothing. And in fact, normally, in most cases, we're not even studying these places. They're just hanging out. And this is one, although this is being studied, and all the ones I'll show you today are being studied by at least one person because that's how I got the pictures. So this is a cinnamon forest in Seychelles. Here's another forest in Hawaii that's like super novel, I guess is the way to say that. There's mango trees in here. There's trees from Australia. There are plants from Asia, plants from tropical America, Southeast Asia. And they're all like growing on each other. They're all in there together. One thing that really surprised me about this system and a lot of other novel ecosystems is their visual diversity, right? When we learn about non-natives, invasive species, we tend to see pictures of monocultures of kudzu or those zebra mussels that are just wall-to-wall blanketing the landscape. And that's very much the image that I had too. But there are a lot of these kind of emerging systems where there are a lot of different non-natives and they're all kind of hanging out together and they're all kind of playing house in this way that sort of uncannily resembles a regular ecosystem. So in this particular forest, a grad student named Joe Mascaro was studying it and measuring a lot of its sort of functional properties. In some ways, he was sort of pretending he was like an ecologist from Mars who didn't know that this was a trashy weed patch, and he was pretending that it was just another ecosystem. So he measured things like how much the trees were growing, how much soil was being created, how nutrients were flowing through the system, how much carbon was being sequestered, and how diverse it was. And he found that in many measures, it outperformed the native systems of Hawaii. This is an ecosystem just kind of being an ecosystem, except that until about 100 years ago, none of these guys had ever met each other before. This is another one that I really like because this is a brand new lava flow. This was just ocean until the 60s, and then this lava flow came out and hardened up. So this is brand new land. And the first 3 colonists are this tree here where you can see a few red flowers is ohia. This is a Hawaiian native. And then the kind of fluffy looking tree is ironwood from Australia. And then this is sword fern from Southeast Asia. So 3 continents, 3 species, first colonists. And you can't even call them invasive because they were the first guys there. So they're off the hook as far as I'm concerned. But another thing that's nice about it is that there's a native there in there with them. And that's one thing that is hopeful about some of these systems, is that they're not exclusively novel. They often have a pretty robust contingent of natives hanging out in there with them. Here's another one. This is from Argentina. This one's fun. Comes from, I'm going to say his last name wrong, Pedro Tongnetti. He's at the University of Buenos Aires. And here's what the pampas in this area looked like before. And then people grazed cattle on it. And then they made farms out of it. And then the soil was probably all screwed up, so they walked away from it. And then this is what you end up with. And structurally, it's very similar, but the species are all different. So it's really interesting to see how these systems unfold. Oftentimes, they will look kind of superficially similar to the sort of historical ecosystem, but the players will be different. But sometimes they look like they're from outer space, like this, which is some mining refuse, some shale that was dumped out from the mine. And then on top of these like space hills, these really nice meadows kind of just spontaneously developed. And people go up there and picnic, and they have these great recreation values and interesting meadow composition. So these are the kind of places that I am putting forth as wilderness, because this square down here and this guy right here, nobody is guiding this. And there is no vision document, and there's no process. And this is nature adapting to what we've done to it. This is the Chinese wattle-necked turtle. I think that's said that right. Chinese wattle-necked soft-shell turtle. And Tag Engstrom at Chico State has studied this guy, and he is interesting because in China, where he's from, where he evolved, he is endangered because he is eaten, very tasty. But in Kauai, where he was originally brought as a lunch item, he is now romping free and doing pretty well and is considered invasive. And this is just one of a growing list of species that are endangered at home and considered invasive in other places. And I think these are great ones to think about, because which value is going to trump here? Are you going to take all of these turtles and put them in boxes and ship them back to China to certain doom in a large tureen? Or are you going to let them hang out and be invasive, because that might be a good way for them to persist into the future? In this particular case, I tend to vote for leaving them in Kauai, and part of the reason is that when they studied what these guys were eating, they found out that a huge chunk of their diet, like I don't remember the exact percentage, but let's say for sake of argument it was 85%, was also non-native. These stream systems are just got a lot of new guys coming in, and you can kind of imagine why, because if you're an island in the middle of the Pacific, it's going to be hard, and you've got a little bit of fresh water, it's going to be hard for freshwater colonists to get to you. So the freshwater flora and fauna was pretty depauperate to begin with, so ripe for invasion. So now these streams are just filled with non-native stuff, and most of it is being eaten by this other non-native guy. So you've got this whole non-native food web there. And the question is, if you take this out because it's non-native, maybe the rest of these guys will boom, maybe you'll give yourself more headaches. If you leave him where he is, you've got a safe population. So I think that, and when I say current perception here, I don't mean sophisticated audiences like you. I mean sort of just Tom, Dick, and Harry at the grocery store. I think that people tend to think that when they see a beautiful place on a David Attenborough special, they think of that as being pristine and unmanaged. And the management that goes into keeping those places beautiful is sort of kept quiet. Not only by the people who make those films, but also by the managers themselves who don't want to make their management intrusive to the visitors at those places. People are perfectly happy with the concept of places that are changed and managed. I mean, that's most of what we walk through every day. That's our cities, our farms, our something on the order of 75% of the ice-free land on Earth is covered with places that are changed and managed. And places that are unmanaged and changed have a very negative reputation. These are trashy places, empty lots, scrubby, feral, weedy. These are the kind of terms that people use to describe them. One ecologist told me that he spent his entire career driving through this stuff to get to this stuff so he could study it. And then one day he thought, well, why don't I just stop the car in here and start sampling in here? And then the notion that something looks pristine and is managed is sort of not on the radar screen of the average person. So here is the perception that I think we might see in the future as some cultural change happens. Things that look historical and are managed are these sort of museum-style protected areas, maybe like Yellowstone. And I'm not sneering at these at all. I think we're going to want these. They're our cultural property, our heritage. These ecosystems are important to us. They've been important in the history of our species. They're beautiful. We have a lot of reasons to want to try to keep some places looking the way they did the day they were made a park, or whatever baseline we've been using. Changed and managed, again, most of the Earth. Something that is unmanaged but looks pristine, I think that as the climate changes and as the anthropogenic drivers like land use change and all these things continue to unfold, we're going to have less and less, and eventually, potentially, depending on how purist you are in your terminology, none. And then stuff that has been changed by these anthropogenic drivers but is actually today unmanaged, that is not being managed by anybody, that's going to be our wilderness. And that's going to be those places I just showed you, those places that are filled with non-native, weedy-looking stuff by the side of the road. So this is where I'm tempted to kind of just run for that door when I get to this part, because I feel like this is kind of a scary idea. But bear with me. So I just saw a great talk last week in Denver at the George Wright Society meeting by Greg Aplett, who's with the Wilderness Society. And he takes this kind of notion to the next level of actually what do we do with this information. And he has a very sensible approach, which opinion which I share, which is that we have to kind of do more than one thing because the future is so uncertain. So climate change, we don't know exactly how that's going to play out. We don't know where it's going to rain more or less or how much temperatures are going to go up. We don't know what's going to go on with a lot of other sort of complex social, cultural, geochemical linked cycles. It's very complicated. So we need to manage in a bunch of different ways. If we manage everything the same way and then that way turns out not to work, we'll be in trouble. So we need a portfolio of management strategies. And one of these might be to resist change, the old-fashioned way, to try to keep ecosystems intact or historical, looking the way they used to. That will be high management, ever higher as time goes on. Another strategy might be doing some of these weird innovations that I talked about at the beginning of the talk, using proxy species or moving species as the climate changes to try to help them find places to live, or doing genetic breeding of plant species. So this would be the innovation sort of approach. And then the third approach would be to do nothing, to really do nothing, to actually put our hands in our pockets and let the invasives walk in and let the climate change and see what nature comes up with. So to kind of show us how this might actually play out in a real place, he chose this area in California with some national forests and Yosemite Park there in the middle. And the cross-hatched areas, which might be hard to see, are designated wilderness. So there's, the whole park is practically the whole park is wilderness. And then a lot of the Sierra forest is wilderness, and not as much of the Stanislaus is wilderness. So to be in an entirely theoretical exercise, he divided it up to these three kind of management strategies. So in the park, where there's a huge cultural weight, you go with the restoration/resist change mode of management, where you try to keep it looking the way it did in the old days. And that jibes pretty well with the kind of rules that bind park managers. And then down here, where you have a lot of wilderness designation, you do the do nothing thing, because that jibes pretty well with how you're supposed to manage wilderness, i.e. you're not supposed to manage it. You're supposed to let it be untrammeled. So we talk about sort of like radical untrammeling over here. And then up there, where there wasn't as much wilderness designation and there isn't a whole lot of cultural baggage, he tries maybe doing some of the innovation techniques. Basically where people won't notice it so much, so they won't freak out. And freaking out is probably why he had to write illustration only in very large letters across his map. Because I can just imagine him giving this talk and people who live anywhere near this thing just kind of going and just, freaking out. So I hasten to add, if you see Greg, this is illustration only. He has no designs on these areas. So check the time. This slide I just made in the last couple of days, and so it's really a work in progress, and I'd love your advice on how to think about some of this. But what I really think about is, if this is the way to go, and I tend to think it is, if we do want to have diversity of management, and if some of that management includes letting it go and not managing, how are we going to talk about that in the future? Because I think right now, all of these possibilities freak some people out for different reasons, and there's a lot of negative talk. Just not intervening, I myself have been guilty of calling that approach giving up in the past, because when I was on my really pro-intervention kick at the beginning of my book writing project. But that's clearly not giving up, because what you're doing is you're letting nature take the reins of how it's going to adapt and change in the face of all these stressors. So I'm trying to talk about letting nature take charge and increasing the amount of wilderness. That's pretty, if people could get behind that. With restoration, people talk about this as being defending our last scraps, or sort of standing at standing at the fence against the barbarians and like, we're locking arms. We will not let this be touched. It's very defensive, not proactive, not happy, but a very defensive pose. And so I like the metaphor of gardening. some people love it and have totally run with it, and it makes them feel like they can be part of doing something. Other people, especially land managers, find it to be icky and they don't like it, and they just think perfect little rows of tulips, you know. When really what I'm talking about is the kind of stuff that's already going on in Yellowstone and other managed areas. And celebrating cultural heritage. You know, if we decide we're going to manage an area to this historical baseline, we should make it clear that this is a cultural move, that we're doing this for cultural reasons. But that's fine. We do lots of stuff for cultural reasons, you know, like wear clothes and listen to music. So it's not that bad of a thing. And then this innovation idea, doing some of these more wacky strategies. I often heard, there's in fact some reviewers of an early novel ecosystems paper called it making lemonade out of lemons. But they weren't even sure if lemonade could be made out of these lemons. They were pretty negative. So I like to think of it as a more collaborative, kind of proactive thing. And these terms, I think I really need to start working with them. But the basic point I'm trying to make here is that all of these strategies can be undertaken in a joyful and positive spirit. They do not have to be seen as the desperate flounderings of people who are letting what they love slip through their fingers. Okay. Homogenization is a big problem for these new wildernesses. This is probably, I think, the biggest conceptual problem between embracing them happily and running out and start hiking through them, is that the same species do tend to show up over and over again in these systems, at least theoretically, right? Like, what people are worried about is that every tropical system will look like every other tropical system, and every kind of Mediterranean system will look like every other Mediterranean system. And I still think a lot more research should be done on this question of how homogenized it's going to get. If you think about cultural parallels, think about Hawaii, because it's a place where there's a lot of incoming species and a lot of incoming cultures. And I think that if you think about the current Hawaiian human culture, it's a mix of European influences, Polynesian influences, Asian influences. There's surfing culture, there's panola culture, there's sugar culture, there's weed culture. I mean, it's all in there together, and it's very cosmopolitan, but it is certainly not like anywhere else. So in some cases, homogenization, I think, is a problem. This is the McDonald's in Hilo, the homogenization of cuisine. But then not far away, you can buy this, which is kind of a fusion of sushi and Spam and chicken, sort of like the three food groups of Asia, European, and Polynesia, all wrapped in one package and available for less than $2. So this is what I like to think of these systems as being potentially something that is new, but also unique to place, or also kind of more like fusion cuisine than McDonald's. All right. So let's wrap up with a couple of thought experiments. And if you have to write about this class for your assignment, you could maybe use these thought experiments as a way to launch your thinking. Stuart Pym, who's a famous conservation biologist who works a lot in South America, once told me that when he sees this plant, which is called the Brazilian, I can never remember the name, so I wrote it down. I thought I wrote it down. The Brazilian, what's it called? Fireberry, pepperberry, Brazilian pepper tree. When he sees this Brazilian pepper tree in Brazil, he thinks it is beautiful. But when he sees this exact same species in Florida, where there is perhaps too much of it, he thinks it's ugly. So his aesthetic understanding of this exact same species changes based on where he sees it. And my perspective is, it's still beautiful in Florida. We might want to hack several thousand acres of it back because of our other management goals, but it's not ugly. It's just trying to do what a plant's trying to do. This is a common mullen, one of my favorite invasives because it's on the cover of my book. And I actually have seen tons of it around here. I've been hanging around just on the sort of national forest outskirts close to town, and there's a lot of this stuff, and it's from Europe. But it doesn't really cause huge environmental headaches. It just kind of shows up by the train tracks and hangs out. So I asked him if he thought that something like this was also ugly, and he said, less ugly, but still ugly, because it's not in the right place. And then here's the pica, which you all know is your local cute thing, and which many people have discussed moving, if the climate gets too hot, moving to a mountains further north or higher mountains so that it could continue to have a good population. So I said, well, what if you had to move the pica, and then you were the guy who picked it up and moved it to the new place? Would it still be ugly in its new place? And he said, no, it would still be cute. So I think that we can learn a lot about how we think about these issues by just trying to think like, you know, is the Brazilian pepper tree beautiful or ugly in Brazil and Florida? Is the common mullen beautiful or ugly in Europe or in Missoula? And is the pica cute or not cute if we move it further north of its current range? So my last slide is one of my kids enjoying nature in a beautiful rustic setting, which is a parking lot island in Yellowstone. So she's in Yellowstone, but there's cars like on all sides of her, and she doesn't care, right? Because she's a baby. And all she's seeing is this tree, and she's having fun, and she's learning about that needles are pokey, and she's smelling it, and she's having a great time. And the point of this is that we do not get born with these ideas about what should count as wilderness and what should be good nature and what should be bad nature. We learn them. And what I worry is that the ideas that we have now have been, in some ways, incredibly useful to us as a conservation movement, because special concern for special wild places drove a huge amount of protection and a huge amount of saving things. And for that, we should be very grateful. But I'm worried that these cultural ideas will be less adaptive for the next generation. If we hand down to our children the notion that in order for something to be truly valuable as wilderness, it must have all of the characteristics listed in the Wilderness Act, and then they grow up in a world in which it is just not possible for something to be both untrammeled and natural, they are going to be very depressed. And I don't want to potentially leave a world for my children that actually has a lot of stuff in it, but that they have been trained to despise. I just think that's a bad idea. And it certainly isn't going to recruit a lot of new people to the conservation movement if we tell them that there used to be this really awesome thing called wilderness, but oops, you were born too late, and so now all we've got is like okay biodiversity reserves that are the next best thing, and we did what we could, you know. I mean, it's like, so I would like to see a role for wilderness in the future, and I would like to see a role for this innovation paradigm in the future, and in different places. And I would like us to love all of those places, and to see them all as nature, and to recreate there, and to find them beautiful, and to make calendars of them, and to teach our children that they are beautiful and valuable. Because these little weed patches, if we just decide that they're not valuable, then they will be Walmarts in another couple of generations. So we need to learn to love them, otherwise we'll lose them. And I think that's it. A friend of mine, Jessica Hellman, told me that although she's very concerned about movements of species due to climate change, she would rather have a world with all the stuff in it. It doesn't matter to her as much where it is. And I think ultimately that's what it comes down to. Thanks so much. Oh, look at me, I'm such a pro. Good, so I guess I just segue right into Q&A. All right, questions? Should I get behind the table? I'll start there. Yeah.
I think the last comment there you think about something. I think it's good to feel bad.
You think it's good to feel bad?
The whole idea of wilderness, maybe the traditional thing made it obsolete, or but it's a decent reference. And so at least we have something to look back on or look forward to.
See, we can look back on it, but I don't think we can look forward to it. And that's why I think it may be maladaptive.
Well, there you go. I still think it's worth, the idea is still worth and having it as reference. That's
Yeah, I'm just for changing what gets the sign that says wilderness area. I'm not throwing away the term wilderness. Because I think it's, personally, I think it's a good idea for humankind to have areas that it doesn't mess with. Take another question?
Well, first, I was at George Wright, and I heard you there, and I enjoyed that. I'm here tonight, and I enjoyed this, so thanks.
Do you see how I changed it up, didn't do the same talk? It's because I knew that Katie was going to be at both talks. Otherwise, I would have given the exact same talk.
And also, based on what he said, I agree that there is a place for despair. I think too often in our society, we try to swallow feelings of darkness without addressing them. So I agree with what he said. But where I'm coming from is I'm studying to be a conservation social scientist, and specifically a wilderness social scientist. So I want to ask you a question. For you to choose a whole number between 1 and 10, with 1 being ecocentrism and 10 being anthropocentrism, and tell me where you think the world view of your book falls on that spectrum.
So that's a great question, because my whole plan when writing the book was to not tell anybody what I think, because I'm not a philosopher, right? I'm not even a scientist, but I play one on TV, right? Like I write about science. So what I wanted to write about was what the science tells us about what's possible, and what the science tells us about what our tools could be, given certain goals. So I tried to couch everything in sort of if statements. If we don't want extinctions, then we should do this. If we value wild places, then we should do this. Now recently, it must be said that while going around speaking about the book in unguarded moments, I have been letting some of my own personal beliefs drip through a little bit. But I kind of think that my own personal beliefs are irrelevant, because my message is about the science. I think that this paradigm works or is useful even if you're a 1 or a 10 on that scale. Because if you're totally biocentric, I think that having a multiplicity of approaches will be the most effective way of ensuring flourishing futures for as many species as possible. And if you're totally anthropocentric, like Ditto, I think that this is a great approach, because it will preserve as many possible options for us to use the hell out of nature into the future. So I sort of think that it doesn't matter, for my argument, whether you're anthropocentric or biocentric. And I'm not going to tell you what I say in the confession booth, right? Like, this is a matter between me and, Mother Earth. So
I guess I was asking you to maybe pretend to be the audience, and maybe how they would come step away from your book after they read it. Like,
Right.
do you think, and also you gave a weasel answer, which is a little frustrating.
Well, how much do you make a year? How about I ask you that? There's some things that you shouldn't ask. My whole point is I wanted people to come away from the book and say, well, there's a lot that can be done. I can go out tomorrow and make something better, not just less bad. I wanted to then get them optimistic and enthusiastic about doing proactive, let's make more nature, let's have a more beautiful, greener future, and not just let's stand at the walls of the last little pristine areas with our swords crossed. So I wanted to flip the narrative for people from defensive to proactive. And in doing so, I hope to reignite the passion of people who are perhaps being burnt out, like myself, by unrelentingly grim narratives. That, and also I'm just kind of a science geek, and I find some of this stuff about ecosystem dynamism and pre-European impacts just intrinsically fascinating. So if I'm pretending to be the audience, I hope there's also a little bit of a gee whiz stuff. That's why my favorite talks are at garden clubs, because they've never even heard of the fact that there used to be giant ground sloths in North America, and that potentially human beings were caused their extinction, and then the ripple effects went out over the entire Midwest, and that just blows their minds. And I don't even have to get to the what should we do about the planet stuff, So.
This is a great talk, and I'm so great that I'm having trouble forming a good question here. But I think what I wanted to ask you was one word that came up on the Wilderness Act that wasn't underlined, but I think is very important. Is a lot of what you're talking about here is contrast.
Right, yeah.
And it seems to me what you're advocating for another type of contrast. Wilderness is a contrast, and it still exists as a contrast to modern society. But you're kind of throwing in a new form of contrast, or a different dimension. And I think that's really valuable. But as a wilderness manager, I think your goal is to continue to provide a certain type of contrast. And basically what you're doing is you're seeing these human influences, the spread of leaves or something like that, and you're trying to put a little bit of more human influence that hopefully somehow,
Preserves the contrast.
yes, preserves the contrast.
Yeah.
And so about this new dimension that you're talking about, I think wilderness is a place where, designated wilderness is a place where we do insert ourselves, but we're trying to make it look as though we don't, essentially.
Right.
But that doesn't mean that these places that are nature-based, we're still not inserting ourselves. We have unintended consequences always affecting these landscapes.
Right.
And so,
A couple of great thoughts there. I mean, one is certainly the lack of active management is not inaction, and I want to make that clear. Like, it's sort of just like opening the door to all of the ongoing background forcings that are going on constantly with the climate and with things moving around and anthropogenic influences. So you could expect that if you want to measure human impact on a system, that unmanaged systems might show more human impact than managed systems, precisely because the management seeks to erase the appearance of human action. It's sort of, we might have a lot of human action, but some of it's going this way and some of it's the exact opposite. It's kind of going like this the whole time, right? So as far as contrast goes, contrast is a part of the Wilderness Act that I haven't thought about as much as I'd like to, because it's sort of only recently trying to wrap my head around it. But I like it, but then there's also weird implications. Like, what if our cities become incredibly biodiverse and green? Then that will diminish the contrast between our cities and wilderness areas. And suddenly our wilderness areas won't seem as wild because we've got all sorts of cool plants and animals at home. So there's, I don't know, contrast is, I need more time to think about contrast. Get back to me in 6 months. Joel.
So I loved your book. It's very provocative. Your talk is very provocative, just to push things, and that's really good. People have to make some decisions or figure out where they are. As you move forth into scenarios with the futuristic world, I think of Mad Max. I think of, you used the word feral, I think of systems in chaos, think of systems in anarchy. I think of Chernobyl. I think of feral dogs. I think of wolves taking over. So what do you do in a situation where you have like a lot of feral animals, dogs and cats? They're having huge impacts on species that haven't co-evolved with them, and they're getting squeezed. How do you resolve, or how do you suggest we go about thinking about those kind of systems? Because you can go from species that haven't co-evolved with these predators, but you can go to plants that get squeezed out. There's a lot of ways along the continuum.
Sure. So there's two answers to that, and one is that sometimes, and I'm not an ecologist, so I'm less confident in this than I would be if I had a PhD to throw around, but sometimes I think coevolution is overrated or oversold. Because when you see these systems that just met each other 5 minutes ago, just hanging out and pumping the nutrients through, and the ferns from one continent are growing on the ferns from the other continent, and they're pollinating each other, and they're dispersing each other's seeds, you think, God, you can kind of get away with a lot without coevolution. So that's point A. I'm sure that there is some level of mutualism that's impossible to have without coevolution, but you get a surprising amount of interaction. And the second thing is that, so there's, I think, for many people, and if I want to come out about my own personal ethical preferences, this would include me, species extinction is a trump card. If something is at risk of going extinct because of management, because you're not managing something, then you have to just say, I loved you as a wilderness, but we're about to lose X, Y, and Z species, so now I'm going to have to go in and do some management. So your case of feral animals putting squeezes on things, in any case where you're actually looking at a global species extinction, I sort of think that that's like flip some sort of switch somewhere, and then you no longer maybe have the luxury of wilderness in that particular situation, because your duty to prevent an extinction trumps. Now that's my own moral calculus. I'm not sure if everyone would agree with me, but and of course, that requires science, that requires prediction, that we should say, okay, the idea that we can sort of just look at the computer and be like, sir, this species will go extinct in 45 minutes unless we come in and kill these 3 cats, we obviously don't have that level of control or predictability, so some of it will have to be guesswork. So I think of these kind of wildernesses as potentially a luxury, but then also one that can be incredibly useful for us scientifically. So when we see how one of these places that's just kind of being, one of these places adapts over time, not only do we preserve this kind of untrammeledness in the world, we also have a huge amount to learn from what it does, what species thrive, which species, how the composition changes over time, that might then kind of circle back and inform our management of the areas that we do manage. So I think they're certainly worth having, even for just really nuts and bolts reasons there. I think that circled your question, at least. Yeah.
Yeah, I really enjoyed reading the talk, and not to reiterate what's already been said, but I really enjoyed that freshness of the things, especially the merit that you give no action, as a reasonable intervention is no intervention.
Right. That's a good way to put it. A reasonable intervention is no intervention.
Yeah,
I like that. Right.
Anyway, but I was wondering, actually, I was wondering if you could help me with an assignment, and I'm trying
What does it do?
I'm trying to come up with a better alternative than historical reference commissions for a management target. And actually, cited you this morning when I was working on it. You talked about one of the people you interviewed was discussing, saying, without having a baseline to target, any intervention is successful, right? So,
right. That's the worry.
And I agree with you that I think that the historical range of conditions are becoming increasingly mute because the predicted changes. So I was wondering if you have I have to put out a statement saying this is what I think we should be managing towards. I was wondering if you had an opinion.
So this is a really big problem for this perspective, and I don't think it's one we can just talk away. Before, there was sort of a kind of a generally accepted and very pervasive cultural value that putting things back the way they used to be was the right answer to a multitude of problems. That it would restore sort of ideal function, that it would be the best road back to high biodiversity, that it would always be the most beautiful state, that it would always serve the highest recreational values, and so on. And so it was kind of easier, right? You just kind of pulled out the historical range of variability, and you often have situations where people sort of just assume that the morally correct answer to any problem is to return it to its historical range of variability. And what this Rambunctious Garden notion of historical baselines not being as useful does is just whips that carpet right out from underneath you, and suddenly you have to come up with a goal for a place and defend it on its sort of own merits and without regard to this reference. So how do you do that? And how do you do it equitably and democratically, and everyone gets a stake, but it's done on a landscape scale and it's scientifically informed, and our goals are sensible for future generations as well as our own. And that is when I hide under the table, because that's a really, really thorny policy question. And it's one that I would love to have the answer to. And I think that the short answer is that it's not going to be easy. It's going to involve just a ton of stakeholder meetings, like more stakeholder meetings than you ever want to sit in your entire life and the lives of your children. And I don't know, it's going to be very difficult, but it's going to have to be some sort of conversation we have, and it's going to have to be site-specific but landscape-informed, and it's going to be very tough. So the answer is, I don't know, it's going to be hard, but it's the task that we have to face because we have no alternative.
You have to put it.
Yeah. See, then you see that I'm always trying to get out of saying where my own values lie, because I don't feel like I have any kind of, I am not the Dalai Lama. Like, I don't have any kind of, my values are not more important than your values. So I don't think actually, come to think of it, I don't think the Dalai Lama's values are more important than your values either. But so I think that when you get to that values question, I really just do have to duck, because it's not, I can tell you what I think, and maybe if you buy me a couple drinks, I'll draw you a whole list of what order everything should be done in. But I really just don't think that's my job. My job is to really just talk about the scientific condition that we're in, the sort of condition that we find ourselves in. Does that make sense? Yeah.
Brief comment, question. I appreciate some of the things you said with regard to, let's say this photograph here, for example, and the fact that it's wild in the sense that it's just doing its thing, nature is doing its thing, it's reclaiming its place or whatever without human management. But what really concerns me, I guess, is kind of fundamental to your presentation, and that is, I think you create a straw man in the way you describe the Wilderness Act.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's a profound mischaracterization of what the Wilderness Act says and what it means. And as a result, for example, that you won't find the word pristine in the Wilderness Act anywhere. Primeval character and influence isn't a reference to what these places look like any more than Mother Teresa's character and influence could be defined by how she looks.
So character isn't visual or species composition?
I don't think that's what character and influence refers to at all. But I think you have to look at it in the full context. Nobody that I've ever read or studied that was involved in the Wilderness Act believed that these areas were pristine.
Yeah.
They understood that they had been influenced by humans and that they would be influenced by humans going forward. But as this guy here mentioned, the word of contrast, these are the places that were the least influenced. These are the places that would be the least manipulated. These are the places where we decided as a culture to show some humility and restraint. So, that's sort of a fundamental problem, but I'm still kind of left with this nagging question about whether your concern is with wilderness, as wilderness is generally defined in our culture. And I don't like the example of Yellowstone because I don't think anybody who believes in wilderness thinks the things you described in Yellowstone are appropriate. That's the way managers are managing Yellowstone for political reasons, dealing with bison and dealing with fire, not because the Wilderness Act tells them to. But is your problem with wilderness, as the Wilderness Act defines it and describes it, and having that sort of system in our culture, do you have a problem with that, or is it mostly that that wilderness idea has kind of eclipsed our concerns for other landscapes that also?
Yeah, so I'm going to stop you before I get too far because there's so many things to. First of all, fantastic point. I totally agree with you that nobody who wrote this or who administers it or who sues based on it thinks that this means totally 100% pristine. I agree, absolutely. However, phrases like natural conditions, I do think tend to be glossed as indigenous species, keeping indigenous species, not losing, and then not adding non-indigenous species, things like that. So that when you talk about natural conditions or primeval character, you do talk about stopping further shift away, right? So we may not have to talk about pristine as this 0 point, and if you walk away from that one step, then you can never go back. What I'm concerned about is that you can't stop the direction or movement of change, that it will continue to move no matter what you do. So my beef with wilderness, I like wilderness. I just like different wilderness, right? But I like the stuff that is designated as wilderness a lot, obviously. I just worry that this definition here we get stretched in two different ways, and the sort of political ramifications of that might be what some people worry about is kind of like a mushy management solution. So there are always going to be politics. So if you're trying to manage for natural conditions and untrammeled at the same time, you're not going to go full hog in either way. You're not going to really stop intervening, or you're not going to really hold it to the baseline. You're just going to do some kind of mushy half-ass thing in the middle. And if that's what we're doing for every single area, that's not a diverse portfolio of management approaches. That's just a bunch of mush. So I guess that's what I want. I don't want us to say that what we're doing, that wilderness is a bad thing. I just want us to say, where are we going to let it go wild, and where are we going to have it be historical nature? But yes, and then the second thing you said is absolutely sort of the root of my concern for the whole book was excessive concern with protected areas. That was where I started. Obviously, most nature conservation groups have moved way beyond just focusing on protected areas in the last few years, decades. But it still tends to be very much where the lay public is in their thinking about conservation. And that, I think, is a real problem, especially if you don't get out, if you can't get out to the wilderness or to the national park very often, and you don't learn to see the nature in your neighborhood, and you feel like you're alienated from the whole nature conservation conversation and community. So that was very much a concern of mine that motivated writing of the book. Yeah, but I agree with you. I mean, the idea that it has to be 100% pristine is the only people who say that are people who don't want to designate something as wilderness, right? They'll say, but look at that one little road, or those old tire tracks. This can't be wilderness. So. Let's see around. There was one here, yeah.
So you were talking about creating or hoping to create more natural areas, right? This kind of notion that it doesn't necessarily have to fit all of these parameters in order to be wilderness. So, I mean, what do you think the role of humans in these areas are then? Because we have so many people, right? And not necessarily all of this space to just be creating protected areas without any use to humans, which sounds, whatever, but.
So I really like Greg's idea of how to do this, which is that you just divide it up and you say, okay, so in some of these areas, now in these innovation zones, like he suggests for this one watershed up here, you could, so when you set your goals could be biodiversity and water filtration or whatever ecosystem service you're interested in. So there's certainly room for getting very people focused in those innovation zones, for sure. And in my mind, these sort of restoration historical preservation zones provide this cultural service of being these touchstone. And in fact, you could argue, I guess mathematically, the more people that live in America, the more people could theoretically visit Yosemite, the sort of more valuable it becomes culturally. So I don't know if I'm answering your question. You want to restate it?
Yeah, I kind of trail off at the end. But I guess I was also thinking in terms of like how do you think like urban areas can play into this? Because you usually think of natural protected areas and places where you don't have that the conflict of city versus nature. But like I don't know I don't know, I guess.
Yeah, so my hope is that part of what I talk about in the book is just blurring these lines a little bit, like accepting the influence of humans into areas that we've considered to be wildernesses, but then also accepting more nature into our human lives. So a lot of the stuff that I've been thinking about and working on is about how to get more nature into our cities and suburbs, even as we increase population. And there's a lot of really, I could give you a whole other talk about some of the fascinating stuff with that, because there's all these really interesting trade-offs. People will take a lot, they will totally be down with taking out their lawn and putting in a grass prairie until the ticks show up, So it's like, there are, and you can flip people from having a really sterile, boring garden to having a really biodiverse garden in their yards, but only if somebody on their side of the street does it first. And the research shows that if somebody on the opposite side of the street has the garden, you won't think your cultural norms won't change, because there's some weird part of our heads where our side are our friends and the guys on the other side of the street are the enemy, right? So there's all these weird sort of psychological aspects to this which are fascinating. But you do see it more, and you do see a hunger for it. The Highline Project in New York City, which is where the picture on the cover of my book comes from, has been such an incredible success. This was an abandoned elevated trainway that, first of all, sort of volunteer plants, things just started growing there naturally as dirt accumulated up there. And it became this bit of weird green that nobody could access in the city. And then it was officially adopted, turned into a park. It's now a green space that winds through part of Manhattan. And people love it. They love it. They can't get enough of it. I'm sure the waiting list to have your wedding photographs taken there was probably several years long. So people are ready to have more nature in the cities. I think that there's a lot of opportunity to do so. And from a sort of very strict biodiversity conservation viewpoint, these projects are often really bad investments, because you've got to pay like Chicago rent or whatever to have this little tiny area, and there's no way you're going to save a whole species there. But the sort of propaganda value or the sort of cultural value to it is immense. So yeah, I think there's a lot of cool stuff there.
On the Highline you brought up, that would sort of have been previously defined as a new wild area. And since our renewed sort of focus and value on this, we're like, ooh, wild. And then
Then it
essentially
will-
they ripped everything up and planted it back again, sort of the same paradigm applied to a new novel ecosystem.
Right.
How that's sort of
Yeah, so that's a great point. And one is like that kind of bumped me out. I wish they would have left a lot more of it just as the way it really did volunteer itself. I mean, many of their landscaping was inspired by the volunteers or included some of those species, but I would have liked it if they'd left a lot of it wild. So it's a real threat, but it's a good problem to have, right? Because what I'm saying is that there's all this land out there, old fields, degraded industrial sites, scrubby parts of parks that have been infiltrated by a lot of weedy species. These areas are so poorly valued right now, nobody cares about them, that they are ripe for just being turned into subdivisions or just, oil palm plantations or what have you. But if we start valuing them, then suddenly the danger becomes that we're going to like over manage them, or that we're going to love them too much, and we're going to, it's going to be bad. Like, that's a good problem to have, in my opinion. Yeah, I agree with you that it would be my dream if I had to start arguing with people who wanted to adopt all these novel ecosystems and manage them into something beautiful, and I had to try to convince them to leave some of them wild. I think we're away from that, but it's a great point. Yeah.
Not being a scientist, does that ever get in the way of being able to write about science?
No, it's so helpful. I can't even tell you how helpful it is. The first thing is I can ask the stupidest questions in the world. If you have a PhD in ecology and then suddenly you're like, oh crap, what does riparian mean? You can't ask somebody what riparian means because they will just take your PhD and rip it up, right? But I can just say, wait, what is this species? Or I don't know what this means. Or so it's incredibly, because then you can find everything out and you can ask dumb questions, and prominent scientists will sit down with you and talk to you like you're 10, and it's just wonderful. The other thing is that you can say all sorts of heretical things, and there's no funding agencies, you don't have an advisor, you don't have this whole hierarchical structure of academia, of academic science, kind of smooshing on you. So yeah, it's great. And I think that a lot of the reason that I saw some of these interesting questions, why it appealed to me, was that I didn't have ecological training. So I didn't have kind of this really strong notion that, for example, like if you look at a lot of these studies, just your average study about changes in an ecosystem, they will often call any change in the ecosystem degradation. So you've got a lake and it used to have such and such amount of nutrients, and now it has more, degradation. You have another lake and it used to have such and such nutrients, and now it has less, degradation. So degradation gets defined as change. And it's hard to see that if you've been reading these papers for 15 years before you get to the point where you can actually give a talk. But when you just come fresh to it, you start to, you notice it, you know what I mean? Now, has it stopped me from being the only problem I can really think about it is that I don't get a salary, right? Like I still have to write magazine articles to get paid. So that would be the big bummer. And no TAs, right? Like I can't just be like, or grad students, I can't be like, this is a really interesting area of inquiry. Could you do a literature review for me and come back in 2 weeks? Like I have to just sit there and do the literature review myself. So that's a bummer. I guess that's it. It's about 8:30. Should we do one more? Okay. Anybody want to be the last question? Please don't make me go out on this complaining about not having grad students. That's yes.
Well, here's a really dumb observation. But one of the things I found so interesting in listening to this is that there's going to have to be a major aesthetic shift. And that aesthetic shift is going to have to happen in urban areas, mostly. Or they're never, ever going to understand what's out there that is being protected or, managed to be protected or what have you. And I find that very exciting. I think that then turns the responsibility to individuals. As you said, why I can have a wilderness in my backyard, period. The aesthetics probably won't please.
Yeah. You may have trouble with your city council or planning neighbor. Yeah.
Good, and I will probably even end up managing it somewhat for my own aesthetics at some point. But that's going to make the real change, I think.
I think that's a great observation. I think the aesthetics of these questions are so fascinating. I mean, you know, just think about the kind of manicured lawn look that is so popular and so energy hogging and so boring and so unbiodiverse. I mean, just changing our preference for lawns into preference for some sort of creeping diverse ground cover assemblage by itself would do a huge amount of good to the planet. So, you know, pushing these aesthetic buttons a little bit is really fascinating. And it's interesting, you know, there's research on how far you can push people before they snap, and I think that that's super fascinating. And they snap eventually. I mean, there's some studies that show you can have incredibly crazy, wild, feral-looking parks as long as you put one path and a bench, and you keep that path and bench clean. And then people will be like, oh, it's a crazy wild garden, I love it. But if you take out the path and the bench, they're like, oh my God, there's probably rats in there. We should call the city. This is terrible, you know. So it's Joan Nassauer does this work. She's in the upper Midwest somewhere, and she calls it cues to care. They're cues, visual cues that show the visitor that somebody is caring for this place. And it's very difficult to provide those cues when what we're doing to care for it is not doing anything to it. So there has to be these kind of notional ways that we show or explain that we are caring for this space by letting it go wild. And that's a really interesting question. How do you do that? So thanks. That's a great observation. All right. I guess that's it. Thanks so much for coming. I appreciate it.